Hi, today we will be covering SA 600 series as we had done the previous series. So let's start. Let's revise SA 600 using the work of another auditor. Now, when is this standard applicable? So this applies in a situation when an auditor, that is the principal auditor, which is reporting on the financial statements of an entity, uses the work of another auditor, which is also known as the other auditor, with respect to the financial information of one or more components which are included in the financial information of the entity. So this standard is applicable only in case the principal auditor uses the work of the other auditor. Other auditor is the auditor who is auditing the financial statements of the component whose financial information is going to be included in the financial information of the entity whose audit is being conducted by the principal auditor. Okay, now when is this standard not applicable? The standard is not applicable in case of joint auditors and in case of auditors' relationship with the predecessor auditor, because we have specific standards for both of these. Now, what are the important terms that you need to understand? First of all, what is the entity's auditor known as? Entity's auditor is known as the principal auditor, and the auditor of the components is known as the other auditor. Components such as the division, branch, subsidiary, joint venture, associates, or other entity whose financial information is going to be included in the entity's financial statements. Now, acceptance as the principal auditor. When will you accept that you are ready to become a principal auditor? For this, you need to consider whether own participation is sufficient or not. If you think that your own participation is sufficient or not, for you to be able to act as a principal auditor, you need to consider the materiality of the portion of financial information which the principal auditor is going to audit. Secondly, the degree of knowledge regarding the business of the components. Third is the risk of material misstatements in the financial information of the components audited by the other auditor and the performance of additional procedures. All these things have to be considered before you accept to become a principal auditor. Now, principal auditor के procedures क्या रहने वाले हैं? So, the principal auditor's procedures are as follows. First of all, he will have to visit the component and examine the books of accounts if it is essential. Secondly, he will have to consider the professional competence of the other auditor only if he is not a member of institute. If he is a member of institute, then no need to consider the professional competence of him. Otherwise, you will have to consider the same. Next is the perform procedures to obtain the sufficient and appropriate audit evidences, review the written summary of the other auditor's procedures, and last one is to consider the significant findings. Now let's discuss all these points one by one in detail. Now first is the visit component and examine the books of accounts if essential. So the other auditor appointed for the component, whether there is any other auditor appointed or not. First of all, you have to see this. If it is not appointed, then the principal auditor will have to himself perform the audit procedures. But if the other auditor is appointed for the component, then in that case, the principal auditor will normally rely upon the work which is conducted by the other auditor, unless special circumstances are there to make it essential for the principal auditor to visit the component and or examine the books of accounts or other records of the components. Second point is consider the professional competence of the other auditor in case he is not the member of institute. In that case, you will have to first of all see whether he is the member or not. If he is a member, then do not consider. If he is not, then you will have to consider his level of competence. Third is perform the procedures to obtain the sufficient appropriate audit evidences that the work of other auditor is adequate for the principal auditor's purposes. Now for this, you need to first of all, as a principal auditor, you need to inform the matters to the other auditor, such as the areas where special consideration is required. Secondly, the procedures for the identification of intercomponent transactions that may require disclosure. Third, the timetable for completion of audit. Now, the principal auditor will also have to advise the other auditor regarding the significant accounting, auditing and reporting requirements, and also to obtain representation as to the compliance with them. Review or written summary of the other auditor's procedures. Now for this, the principal auditor will discuss with the other auditor that these are the audit procedures applied, or these are the procedures that have been applied to review the audit summary. The principal auditor is going to discuss with the other auditor the audit procedures that have been applied or reviewed, and he will also review the written summary. Written summary will include the procedures and the findings, and this will be in a form of completed questionnaire or in a form of checklist. So what are we going to do over here? We are going to, as a principal auditor, we are going to discuss with the other auditor that these are the audit procedures that have been applied, and he will also review the written summary. Written summary is nothing, just a summary containing the procedures and the findings, and this is in the form of checklist or questionnaire. Next point is consider the significant findings of the other auditor. So the principal auditor will discuss with the other auditor and the management of component the findings or the other matters which are affecting the financial information of the components. Also, the principal auditor is going to decide the supplemental tests of records or financial statements of the components, only the necessary ones. Now, these supplemental tests will depend upon the circumstances to be performed by whether the principal auditor is going to perform the same or the other auditor is going to perform the same. The principal auditor should document the following. First of all, he will have to document the components which are being audited by the other auditor. Secondly, he will have to perform the audit procedures that have been performed and conclusions reached. He will have to document the same. Third, the conclusion as to immateriality of a component. If you are considering a component as immaterial, then how did you reach that conclusion? Next is manner of dealing with the audit report of the component auditor. Like the other auditor has given you the audit report, so how are you dealing with the same? You will have to maintain a documentation with respect to the same. Coordination between the auditors. So the principal auditor and the other auditor should have sufficient liaison among themselves. For this, the principal auditor may issue a written communication to the other auditor. The other auditor, knowing the context in which his work is going to be used by the principal auditor, should coordinate with the principal auditor, adhering to the timetable which is being provided by the principal auditor to him, bringing to the attention of the principal auditor any significant finding. Third is the compliance with the relevant statutory requirements, and fourth is he should respond to the detailed questionnaire. Reporting, consideration and division of responsibility की बात करते हैं तो when the principal auditor relies on the work performed by the other auditor, the principal auditor should state in his report about the division of responsibility in the other matter para as per SA 706. If you remember, other matter para 706 में दिया होता है आपको अपने audit से related कुछ भी बताना होता है तो आप अदर मैटर पैरा के अंदर देख सकते हो, बट यहाँ पर आप क्या कर रहे हो, सिंस यहाँ पर आपकी क्या हो रही है, डिवीजन ऑफ रिस्पॉन्सिबिलिटी हो रही है विद रिस्पेक्ट टू ऑडिट, तो ऑडिट को समझने के लिए यूजर्स को आप कहाँ पर बता सकते हो, एडिशनल इन्फॉर्मेशन कहाँ दे सकते हो, अदर मैटर पैरा में, तो वहाँ पर यू आर गोइंग टू मेंशन द डिवीजन ऑफ रिस्पॉन्सिबिलिटी दैट दिस वर्क इज डन बाय दिस ऑडिटर एंड दिस वर्क इज डन बाय मी. ठीक है, तो यहाँ पर डिवीजन ऑफ रिस्पॉन्सिबिलिटी का आप एक पैरा स्टेट कर सकते हो. When the principal auditor concludes that the work of other auditor cannot be used and he is also unable to collect the audit evidence from the audit procedures performed by himself, then he will have to modify the audit report. That is, either the qualified or disclaimer of opinion has to be given as per SA 705. The principal auditor would not be responsible in respect of the work which is entrusted to the other auditor, except in circumstances which should have aroused his suspicion about the reliability of work performed by the other auditor. अगर आपको ऐसी चीज़ें दिखती है जहाँ पर आपका डाउट अराइज होना चाहिए था और आपने नहीं किया, तो उस केस में you will be held responsible as a principal auditor, otherwise not. Otherwise, you are going to, since you are going to rely on the work which is being performed by the other auditor, so he is solely responsible for that. You cannot be held responsible. When the principal auditor has to base his opinion on the financial information of the entity as a whole, relying upon the statements and reports of the other auditor, his report should clearly state the division of responsibility for the financial information of the entity by indicating the extent to which the financial information of components which are audited by the other auditor, and this has to be included in the financial information of the entity, because since the financial information of the entity includes the information of components and the components have been audited by some other auditor, you have to mention all these information in your division of responsibility para. For example, the number of divisions or branches, subsidiaries, other components which are audited by the other auditor, this has to be mentioned in the division of responsibility para. Then and there only, तभी आपके साथ क्या होगा, then in that case only you will not be responsible for the work which has been performed by other auditor, unless and until the work should have been except the circumstances in which there should have been a doubt that you must have raised. Otherwise आपका हर केस में division of responsibility applicable रहेगा. ठीक है, तो for this you need to mention the clear division of responsibility in the other matter para. Okay, so this is all about SA 600. Let's revise SA 610. Let's revise SA 610, which is using the work of internal auditor. So what is the meaning of internal audit function? So internal audit function is a function that performs the assurance and consulting activities that are designed to evaluate and improve the effectiveness of the entity's governance, risk management, and the internal control activities. So let's talk about all these one by one. First of all, let's talk about entity governance. Now for this, to assess the accomplishment of the objectives of ethics, values, transparency, fairness, accountability. Risk management की बात करें, to assist the entity in identifying and evaluating the significant exposures to risk. And third one is internal control activities, to evaluate the internal controls, to examine the accounting and financial information, to ensure the compliance with laws and regulations, to review the operating activities. Internal control activities are there. Now, using the work of internal auditor. First of all, statutory auditor may use the work of internal auditor as many working areas of both the audits are common. However, before deciding whether to use the work of internal auditor, the statutory auditor needs to perform certain procedures. First of all, he will have to determine whether, in which area and to what extent the work of internal auditor can be used. For this purpose, the statutory auditor shall evaluate the objectivity of the internal auditor, the level of competency he has, and the approach which is being used by the internal auditor. If the statutory auditor is of the opinion that the internal auditor performs with objectivity, he is competent and he has used systematic and disciplined approach, then the statutory auditor may decide to use the work which is being performed by the internal auditor. He will have to evaluate the scope of internal auditor and the extent to which the internal auditor would, so as to determine the nature and extent of the work to be used and the degree of reliance that can be placed. If the statutory auditor decides to use the work of internal auditor, he is required to make appropriate documentation and he has to also ensure appropriate testing of the area of reliance, because you are relying on the work of internal auditor does not relieve you from your responsibilities. You can use his work, but does not mean that you will not be responsible for the work which is being done by him. Okay, now examples or areas where the statutory auditor can rely on the work of internal auditor: verification of trade receivables, fixed assets, inventories. इनके लिए you can definitely rely on the work of internal auditor, जैसे कि आपको trade receivables external confirmations लेनी है, fixed assets की physical verification, inventory की physical verification. For all these things you can definitely rely on his work. But the final responsibility for the opinion that you express in the audit report is of the statutory auditor only. You cannot say that the work was done by the internal auditor, so I am not responsible for the opinion, which is incorrect. No, you cannot say that. Now, first point mein we talked about using the work of internal auditor, but now we are going to talk about taking the direct assistance of the internal auditor. Now in this case you are not using the work which was earlier performed by him, but now you are taking the direct assistance from him. Okay, there is a difference between the two. So now let's talk about using the direct assistance of internal auditor. Direct assistance from internal auditor can be taken if it is not prohibited by law and regulation, there are no significant threats as to the objectivity of the internal auditor, and internal auditor is sufficiently competent and capable to perform. You will have to determine the nature and extent and work on which the direct assistance can be taken. Direct assistance is not advisable on the following matters. You should not take. Okay, you should not take, because it is not advisable for you to take direct assistance on the matters which involve significant judgments in audit, for example the accounting estimates, subsequent events, etc. The matters on which the auditor assessed high risk of material misstatements, for example in case of related party transactions or in case you are evaluating the going concern assumption as per SA 570. Matters on which internal auditor is already engaged, for example entity risk assessment process, evaluation of internal control system. Since he is already engaged in it, how can you say please check this work? No, you cannot take the direct assistance of him in case he is already involved in that particular work. Matters on which statutory auditor has to take decision under this essay regarding the internal audit function, that is the evaluation of internal audit function. You are going to take some decisions based on the internal audit function and you are seeking the direct assistance from the internal auditor only. Can you expect कि आपको सही आंसर मिलेगा उस केस में? No, you cannot expect. तो यहाँ पर आपको it's not advisable that you take the direct assistance from him. Using direct assistance के लिए you have to do two things. First of all, you will have to take the written agreement. You will have to obtain the written agreement from both the authorized representative of the entity and the internal auditor as well. You will have to definitely exercise quality control measures as to direction, supervision and review of work of internal auditor. Now let's talk about the factors which are affecting the objectivity, competency and approach. So objectivity की बात करते हैं of the internal auditor. So objectivity refers to the ability to perform without allowing bias to override the professional judgments. Factors that may affect the external auditor's evaluation include the following. First of all, the organizational status of the internal audit function, the conflicting responsibilities, oversight functions of TCWG with respect to employment, decisions related to internal audit function, constraints or restrictions which are placed on the internal audit function by the management or TCWG. Okay, I'm not going to explain everything over here because we are just revising the whole standard in a quick manner. In case you are not sure about the concept or why these words have been written or why these lines have been written in this essay, you should definitely check out the detailed video for explanation part. This is just a quick revision video. I'm just reminding it to you again because I don't know if you are using it for the first time understanding or you are just using it for revision. If you are using it for understanding purpose, then I'm sorry, you are not going to understand anything here. It's just for quick revision. Okay, let's move on to the next part, that is level of competency. Competency of internal audit function refers to the attainment of knowledge and skills to enable assigned tasks to be performed diligently. Now, what are the factors that may affect the external auditor's determination? So, first of all, the policies for hiring, training, assigning internal auditors to internal audit engagements, the adequate of technical training or proficiency in the auditing of internal auditors, the knowledge of internal auditors with respect to entities' financial reporting and the applicable FRF, membership of relevant professional bodies that oblige internal auditor to comply with the relevant professional standards. So these are some of the factors that the auditor can consider while using the work of internal auditor or while you taking the direct assistance from him. Next, systematic and disciplined approach. Now, what are the factors that may affect the external auditor's determination of whether the internal audit function applies a systematic and disciplined approach? So, there are 2 points in it. First of all, the existence, adequacy and use of documented internal audit procedures, how he is documenting his procedures. Second, the existence of appropriate quality control policies and procedures for the internal audit function. Okay, so this was all about Essay 610 using the work of internal auditor. Essay 620 using the work of an auditor's expert. So this essay deals with the auditor's responsibilities regarding the use of individual or organization's work in the field of expertise other than accounting or auditing when that work is being used to assist the auditor in obtaining the sufficient and appropriate audit evidences. Why other than accounting or auditing? Because you are using the work of an of another expert just as to get an idea over those areas or to obtain sufficient and appropriate audit evidences of those areas in which you are not efficient or proficient. Okay, because you have knowledge about accounting and auditing but you don't have knowledge about something else. For example, some engineering related work or some actuarial work, you don't have so much of knowledge to come on to some conclusion, or you cannot obtain sufficient appropriate audit evidences in that case on your own. So in that case you might need some help. Iske liye you are appointing the expert. Okay, it's just like a management expert, but the difference is here the auditor is taking help from the expert, and in essay 500 the management takes help from his expert. So this is the difference between the two. Otherwise both of them are same. Both of them help. One is helping the management and one is helping the auditor. That's it. Okay, now let's talk about important pointers. First of all, auditor's responsibility is not at all reduced by the auditor's use of the work of an auditor's expert. He remains sole responsible for the opinion which is being expressed. Okay, this essay does not deal with the engagement team members is expert in a specialized area of accounting or auditing, because here we are talking about the expert who is an expert in other than accounting or auditing. Okay, now auditor uses the work of management's expert. This we had already covered in essay 500 where he checks the management's expert's competency, his level of objectivity and all those things. Here we are not going to talk about management's expert. Next is, what is the objective of auditor? So the objective of auditor is to determine whether to use the work of an auditor's expert and that work is adequate for his purpose or not. He has to determine that. What is the difference between the auditor's expert and the management's expert? So the status is same, that is it can be an individual also or it can be an organization also. Expertise की बात करें तो दोनों ही other than accounting and auditing में एक्सपर्टीज होल्ड करते हैं. बेनिफिशियरी की बात करें तो ऑडिटर्स एक्सपर्ट, एज आई टोल्ड यू, द बेनिफिशियरी इज द ऑडिटर, एंड इन केस ऑफ मैनेजमेंट एक्सपर्ट द बेनिफिशियरी इज द एंटिटी. वर्क, यूज ऑफ वर्क की बात करें तो आप उसका काम यूज क्यों कर रहे हो ऑडिटर्स एक्सपर्ट का? टू ऑब्टेन द सफिशिएंट एंड एप्रोप्रिएट ऑडिट एविडेंसेस, वेयर एज द मैनेजमेंट एक्सपर्ट इज यूज्ड टू help the management to prepare the financial statements. Next, what are the matters or areas where the auditor can use the expert's work? So first of all, he can use the work in case of valuation of complex financial instruments, plant and machinery, land and building, jewelry, works of art, antiques, assets acquired and the liabilities assumed in the business combinations, impaired assets, intangible assets, all these things. Actuarial calculation of liability which is associated with the insurance contracts or employee benefit plans, interpretation of contracts, laws and regulations, estimation of oil and gas reserves, valuation of environmental liability, site cleanup costs, analysis of complex and unusual tax compliance issues. All these matters can be the ones where you can take the help of expert. Now, what are the procedures that needs to be followed while using the work of an auditor's expert? So first of all, determine the need, whether you require an expert or not. Secondly, you are going to evaluate his competency, capability and objectivity of the person that you are proposing to engage. Next, obtain an understanding of the work to ensure the appropriateness of expert's work for audit purposes. Then you are going to enter into a detailed and a written agreement with that expert. And lastly, you are going to evaluate the adequacy of his work with respect to the findings and conclusions, whether the findings and conclusions are relevant, reasonable, consistent with the other evidences. Secondly, the assumptions and methods which he has used, whether they are relevant, whether they are reasonable, and the source data, that is whether the source data is relevant, accurate and complete. Now, the auditor's expert work is not adequate. If you think that the work of an expert is not adequate, then you will have to discuss this matter with the expert. Now, if the expert says that the limitation was being imposed by the management because of which his work is not adequate, then in that case, the auditor will have to discuss this matter with the management. And if the management is not agreed to provide the required information, then definitely you are going to modify your report as per SA 705. And in case you think that this is not because the management has imposed some limitation, but because the expert's procedures were not appropriate, then in that case you will decide the additional procedures that need to be performed. And if the expert is not willing to perform those additional procedures, you are going to replace the expert. काम नहीं करा, जिस चीज के लिए रखा था काम नहीं करा, निकाल दो, ठीक है, रिप्लेस कर दो, किसी और को ले आओ उसकी जगह पर. Now, use of auditor's expert's report reference in the audit report. Are you going to use the reference of the report which is being issued by the auditor's expert? So in case you are giving an unmodified audit report, then there is no need for you to give any reference. But in case you are giving a modified audit report, you can give a reference to make the modification more understandable. Like, why are you giving modified opinion? You can back your modified opinion with a report by giving a reference to the report of an expert, but this can be done only after taking consent from him. Now, what are the considerations when deciding whether to use an auditor's expert? So in this particular case, whether the management has used a management's expert in preparing the financial statements. So आपको अपने expert की ज़रूरत कब पड़ सकती है? जब management ने भी अपना expert employ किया हो, engage किया हो. क्योंकि management अगर कोई management expert engage किया तो हो सकता है ना कोई ऐसा matter है where there is a requirement आपको भी अपना expert लाने की ज़रूरत पड़ जाए because you might not have so much of knowledge in that particular specific area. Next, the nature and significance of the matter, including its complexity, the risks of material misstatements in the matter, the expected nature of procedures to respond to identified risks, including the auditor's knowledge of and experience with the work of experts in relation to such matters, and the availability of alternative sources of audit evidence. Now, what are the factors that are going to influence your decision with respect to use of auditor's expert when the management had used a management's expert? So in this case, first of all, the nature, scope, objectivity of the management's expert work. Second, whether the management's expert is employed by the entity or is the party engaged by it to provide relevant services. The extent up to which the management can exercise control or influence over the work of management's expert. Fourth, the management's expert's competency and capabilities. And fifth, whether the management's expert is subject to technical performance standards or other professional or industry requirements or not. Sixth, any control within the entity over the management's expert work. Evaluation of competence, capabilities and objectivity of auditor's expert. So competence की बात करें तो you are going to see the nature and level of expertise that he holds. Capabilities की बात करें तो the ability to exercise the competence in the circumstances of engagement. You have the competency, but are you able to apply the same to the circumstance of the engagement? ऑब्जेक्टिविटी की बात करें तो पॉसिबल इफेक्ट्स दैट बायस या फिर कॉन्फ्लिक्ट ऑफ इंटरेस्ट या फिर इन्फ्लुएंस ऑफ अदर्स मे हैव ऑन हिज प्रोफेशनल और बिजनेस जजमेंट. Next, what are the sources of information on competence, capabilities and objectivity? How are you going to see whether the expert is competent, capable and objective? So for this you can have the personal experience. If you had worked with him before, then you might have some personal experience with the previous work of that expert, or you might have had discussions with him, discussions with another auditors or with other auditors or others who are familiar with that expert's work, या फिर knowledge of that expert's qualifications, membership of a professional body or industry association, license to practice, or other forms of external recognition, published papers or books which are written by that expert, auditors, firms, quality control procedures and policies. All these things can help you. Next is evaluating the objectivity of that expert. For this, it may be relevant to inquire the entity about any known interests or relationships that the entity has with the auditor's external expert that may affect that expert's objectivity. Discuss with that expert any applicable safeguards, including any professional requirements that apply to that expert, and evaluate whether the safeguards are adequate to reduce the threats to an acceptably low level. Interests and relationships that may be relevant to discuss with the auditor's expert include financial interests, business and personal relationships, provision of other services by the expert, including by the organization in case of an external expert, that is an organization, and obtain WR about any interests or relationships with the entity of which the expert is aware. Okay, you can do all these things to make sure that there is objectivity and there is no personal bias or interest, conflict of interest. Now let's talk about the agreement with the auditor's expert. So agreement is often in the form of engagement letter, where the nature, scope and objective of the auditor's expert work is going to be mentioned, and you may also include the relevant technical standards or professional industry requirements. Also, you can mention the respective roles and responsibilities of that expert and the auditor, the nature, timing and extent of the communication, including the form of report, need for the auditor's expert to observe confidentiality, because this is very, very important requirement under ethical requirements of law and regulation. Next, what are the factors suggesting need for detailed and written agreement with the auditor's expert? What are the factors that help you identify or help you know that there is a need for you to have a detailed written agreement? First of all, the auditor's expert will have access to sensitive or confidential information of the client, and as well as maybe the procedures that you are performing. So in this particular case, you will have to have a written agreement. Detail होना चाहिए, जिससे कि कोई भी confidentiality breach ना हो, कोई भी client का sensitive information या data कहीं बाहर leak ना हो जाए. Next, roles and responsibilities of the auditor and the auditor's expert are different from those normally expected. Obvious है. The greater extent of auditor's expert work, significance अगर ज़्यादा है तो definitely there is a need कि आपको written agreement कर लेना चाहिए, and that should be detailed. मल्टी जुरिस्डिक्शनल लीगल और रेगुलेटरी रिक्वायरमेंट्स अप्लाई, या फिर मैटर जो है वो हाईली कॉम्प्लेक्स है, या फिर यू आर हैविंग द फर्स्ट एक्सपीरियंस विद द एक्सपर्ट, सो यू डोंट हैव एनी प्रायर एक्सपीरियंस. तो डेफिनेटली एक बार पहली बार जब किसी के साथ काम कर रहे हो, यू डोंट नो वेदर ही हाउ मच प्रोफेशनल ही इज इन हिज वर्क, सो डेफिनेटली you should have a detailed and written agreement with him. Next, specific procedures to evaluate the adequacy of auditor's expert work for the auditor's purposes. So first of all, reviewing the auditor's expert's working papers and reports. Second, inquiries of the auditor's expert. Corroborative procedures जैसे कि observing the work of the expert, examining the published data जैसे कि statistical reports from the reputable authoritative sources, confirming relevant matters with the third parties, performing detailed analytical procedures, and re-performing the calculations. These are some of the specific procedures that you can, the corroborative procedures that you can perform in as a specific procedure to evaluate the adequacy of his work for your purpose. Second is the next point is discussion with another expert with relevant expertise. For example, when the findings or conclusions of the auditor's expert are inconsistent with the other audit evidences that the auditor has obtained, in this case definitely you can discuss this matter with some another expert as well. Discussing the auditor's expert report with the management. Now, what can be the factors suggesting the need for different or extensive procedures? So, the work of auditor's expert relates to a significant matter that involves subjective and complex judgment. So, in this case, there might be a need for you to extend your procedures. Second, the auditor has not previously used the work of the expert and has no prior knowledge of that expert's competence, capabilities, and objectivity. That is the first time experience है उस auditor's expert के साथ. Next is the auditor's expert is performing procedure that are integral to the audit rather than being consulted or provide advice on individual matter. काफ़ी ज़्यादा integral है, अगर उधर वहाँ पर गलती होगी तो काफ़ी ज़्यादा आपके ओपिनियन पर इम्पैक्ट आ सकता है उस चीज़ का. तो डेफिनेटली देयर इज़ अ नीड कि आपको थोड़े एक्सटेंसिव प्रोसीजर्स रखने पड़ेंगे, क्योंकि एक तरीके से आप उसको इंडिविजुअली ट्रीट नहीं कर सकते कि हाँ गलती हो गई तो ठीक है बस इसी पार्ट में गलती होगी. नो, इफ़ दिस मैटर गोज रॉन्ग तो हो सकता है आपका पूरा ऑडिट का ओपिनियन ही चेंज हो जाए. Right. Next, the expert is an auditor's external expert and is not therefore subject to the firm's quality control policies and procedures. तो हो सकता है वो उतनी अच्छे से quality ensure ना करे, काम अच्छे से ना करे, तो इसीलिए you need to extend your procedures. So that's about it. SA 620.
I hope this video could help you in some way. If it did, please like the video, share it with your friends, and subscribe to the channel. Also, you can connect with me on a lot of social media platforms, links in the description box below. I'll see you in the next video. Till then, stay safe, stay healthy, stay happy, and bye-bye.